Good afternoon, and welcome to our second webinar in the webinar series that is organized under the name of ELIMED, which is a collaboration between ELIAMEP, the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, and Medyascope. These two institutions have joined their forces to make a contribution to more diverse and pluralistic debate on a number of issues and topics that are of importance for both Turkey and its neighborhood. And the ELIMED project consists of seven 75-minute webinars, as we are holding the second one here now, and which is organized in the format of a roundtable, which will be followed by 7 papers summarizing the key points. And today we are going to focus on the concept of democratic backsliding in the media systems, media settings. I'm Eylem Yanardağoğlu. I will be moderating the webinar today. I'm an associate professor at Kadir Has University New Media Department in Istanbul. And I'm also a non-resident fellow at ELIAMEP's Turkey program. And we are first going to start with some concepts and maybe definitions, because both in popular and academic efforts, there were efforts to explain the authoritarian turn in Turkey in the recent years. And usually different periodizations are offered in terms of economic and political factors. And I would like us to start with some concepts first, and then to look at some experiences of my distinguished guests and their viewpoints on these key turning points, key events maybe. Before I start with my questions, I would like to briefly introduce my guests to you. Start with Gayeshin, who is an associate professor of media culture at the College of Staten Island in the US, and her research interests are in global media and communication, with a special focus on Turkey and the Middle East. She is also interested in issues of global internet policies, online surveillance and censorship, and she is the author of Media in New Turkey, the book, which was published by University of Illinois Press in 2016. Işın Elicin, who's an editor at Medyascope, a senior media professional who has a lot of experience in the media in Turkey. She has worked as an anchor, as an editor, columnist, both in newspaper, television, radio, in magazines as well. And she will be sharing her also professional and personal views on the issues that we are going to discuss. And last but not least, Marius Dragomir, who is the director of Center for Media, Data and Society and the visiting professor at Central European University in Vienna. And as the director of the center, which is focusing on especially information and communication policy issues, based at the School of Public Policy in Central European University. Marius is an expert in broadcast media and telecom regulation, also conducts a number of comparative analysis, which I'm sure he's going to share with us the findings from this research. So, like I said, I would like to start with some definitions and to sort of lay the ground for basic concepts and definitions. So I will give the floor to Bilge first, and then Işın, to look at different periodizations and discuss maybe key points and key events. Bilge, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eylem, and thank you for inviting me to this important event. Very happy to be here. So I want to start with, explaining a couple of the terms, like you said, and, concepts that we'll be talking about today. And the first one is democratic backsliding. So this term, as a lot of people know, has been, has become hugely popular over the last decade or so. So it basically refers to democratic reversal. So whereas in the 20th century, we have seen a lot of, like democracies backsliding or regressing through military coups and whatnot, or electoral fraud, now we see new ways of this democratic regression. Of course, this doesn't mean that, like military coups or electoral fraud have completely disappeared, but the democratic reversal is now being undertaken by elected incumbents. So we usually refer to the weakening of democratic rule by this term, democratic backsliding, and this can be done in via several like strategies or methods. So basically it's about the removal of checks and balances, especially checks on the executive power. We also refer to like decline in the rights of the citizens that they typically enjoy. And sometimes democratic backsliding can occur in extreme cases where the incumbents go after the integrity of the electoral system itself. And as I said earlier, since 2010s, this has been a global phenomena. This has become, like a global trend, democratic backsliding. And this is not just something that's exclusive or specific to, like the democracies, new democracies in, like global South or in other parts of the world, but we see this, like regression in established Western liberal democratic systems, the United States being the prime example here after, like the election of Donald Trump and, like democratic weakening in the United States. So just to give a few figures, according to Freedom House's report, the number of countries, for example, that declined in democracy, it was in 2010, Freedom House put that number at 49. In 2019, this number increased to 64. And again, like this can be happening in both new democracies and consolidated democracies. So no one really is immune from this backsliding. And a few things about how democratic backsliding occurs. Levitsky and Ziblatt, they published this important study, and they basically talk about 3 steps, which can happen incrementally or, like at the same time. And they talk about, as I said, 3 areas where democratic backsliding occurs: targeting the referees of the state. By referees, like we are talking about, like the targeting of the judiciary, targeting of law enforcement and regulatory agencies. Then the second one is the targeting of the political opponents. So this could be political opposition leaders, political opposition parties, obviously media, and we're going to go on, into more detail about this. There could also be the targeting of business leaders, NGOs, civil society leaders. And the last, the third pillar of this democratic backsliding is the changing the rules of the governing. So the changes that are made to certain legislation, constitution, even the electoral system. The important point to keep in mind is that, when the elected incumbents make all these changes and, target these, civil society actors or media or political opponents, they're doing all of this in the name of the public good, right? So I think we need to keep in mind that one of the most important dynamics of, or factors that contribute to democratic backsliding is the sense, is this polarization that, they're the good guys and the bad guys. And the bad guys are usually described as enemies of the state. And there is this, sense of urgency and crisis. So anything and everything that can be done must be done to protect the state. And just to, finish up on this, I don't want to go into too much detail about what happened in Turkey in terms of democratic backsliding, but I think it's nonetheless important to highlight a couple of turning points or a couple of, like important developments. So when the AKP came into power in 2002, things were pretty calm after until they, like their second term that began in 2007. So after 2007, we see how Erdogan had amassed, like more and more power within the party. So that kind of, like somewhat equal distribution of power within, like the AKP founders started to disappear, right? And that second term in office. And then there were amendments that were made to the constitution about the presidential term limit, about the presidential election procedures. There were also changes made with regard to the composition of the constitutional court and the composition and the election of High Council of judges and prosecutors. And the last important, I think, one of the most important developments was in 2017, this transition from parliamentary system to presidential system. In terms of targeting of the political opponents, I think we're all familiar with, like the imprisonment of Kurdish politicians, removal of elected, like Kurdish mayors, several restrictions that have been placed on NGOs, and especially after the coup attempt, like the closing down of, like several NGOs together with, media organizations. And I think, like one other thing that's important to mention here is how, civil society actors and NGOs have been kind of criminalized and have been labeled as enemies of the state, as terrorist agents, or, like traitors who are acting with, like Western agents to depose Erdogan of power. And we're all familiar with what happened to Osman Kavala, right, as an important civil society actor, together with, like several others who have been, like criminalized in this way. So this, I think, I hope gives, like an overview of what we mean by the term and how it has transpired in the Turkish context.
Thank you, Lilia. Thank you. And maybe we can turn to Işın Eliçin to give us a reflection on, the notion of democratic backsliding in the media context. And you have worked in the media in various sectors, even also in the period before AKP came to power. So maybe you are in a position to compare and to share some personal reflections there with us.
Thank you, Eylem. Thank you very much. And also, I would like to stress that I'm very much honored to be among these distinguished experts. Yes, I would like to mention first in 1990s when I started journalism career. I started in press, in print media. My career started in 1993. In those times, I just wanted to remember that the ownership structures of media was changing. We began to have, before then, Turkey used to have media owners who has journalistic background in their families. But with the 1990s, now business people began to get hold of these media companies. We can some other time we can discuss the reasons, but these business-minded people, which gradually became conglomerates and just think of in business mindedness. I mean, they didn't think about the public good. So I just wanted to remind you about that. But one issue, especially, I would like to highlight from that times is that is regarding the precarization of journalistic work, and it started in the 1990s. Though we nowadays talk about precarization more often. In Turkey, I think in journalism, precarization of the journalistic work started in the 1990s. During those periods, especially after a limited number of conglomerates I mentioned began to dominate the media market, unionization was discouraged and prevented. The number of journalists employed within the scope of press labor law became scarce, and there was not much job security left for us due to increasing irregular, even unregistered employment, and of course there was great labor exploitation. So I wanted to mention this because the fear of being fired, invites a culture of self-censorship as well. So we had this as a culture in our media environment, starting from 1990s. Another fear that makes journalists prone to the censorship, as you know, is of death and violence, and especially in the 1990s, beginning of 1990s, it was acute, the violence against media workers. According to Turkish Journalists Association, 67 journalists were killed between 1909 to this date, and 1/3 of them, a total of 22 journalists, were killed within 2 years, 1992 and 1993. This was, a very violent atmosphere to be a journalist. And also we remember Uğur Mumcu, for example, assassination, because we commemorate that. But most of the time at the time were Kurdish journalists or working for Kurdish press. And also in 1994, the office and printing house of, again, pro-Kurdish newspaper Özgür Ülke were bombed. So I think it was, this fear also helped a new culture that you internalize censorship in a way, because it was very difficult to be investigative journalists. But when we come to the beginnings of the beginning of 2000 is, I think we had this relative freedom of press. It was wonderful for me, especially because in 1999, though we had an earthquake and political instability and an economic crisis between 1999 and till the AKP come to power, it was the start of this 24 hours news channels. And this I started to work for CNN Turkey, and then after 2 years I passed to the NTV, and we had this freedom because we had these live coverages. Especially I wanted to mention because we could be doing, we were doing critical coverages. I especially wanted to mention one from CNN Turk regarding the prison operations in 1999. We had this live coverage. We showed everything what's going on, the state violence against these prisoners, all of that. And also in the 2002, when I was working for the NTV, it was just before the Iraqi war, and I remember our also coverage helped this pro-war, pro-peace stance, or although the AKP leadership was wanted to have American forces to pass through Turkey for this war effort, and I think it was critical in that sense. I would not go further, but I would like I'd like to say that this relative freedom of press media, I think, began 2007 was critical for that. From that on, we began to lose this freedom gradually at first. Then it went much more faster, as we will talk maybe later on. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Işın. 2007 comes up in popular analysis, in academic analysis, and maybe in the second round of questions we can look into much detail why this is the case. And of course, this is relating to the beginning of what is known as the pool media, the organization, this changing structure of media in general. So we can look at it in more detail, but I'd like to turn to Marius now to see his reflections on how media relations and democratic backsliding is observed in other countries.
Sure. Good afternoon. Yes, I think I would like to pick it up right here with the year 2007, because that is fundamental in understanding the decline in media freedom over the past more than a decade. And our research done in a number of countries beyond Turkey, Eastern Europe, but in other countries shows that was a combination of the financial crisis, which had a major impact on many media outlets. You remember probably the slashing of the advertising budgets, the sale of many media companies, and all that, and the rise of new technologies, which in many countries, many media outlets were not maybe ready to embrace them. You remember the spread of the Google-based advertising sale model. You remember how the social media started to become major players in the advertising market and markets and all that. And that had a major impact on what we had today. And this is going to the heart of your question, I think, about the democratic backsliding, because a major pillar or element of this democratic backsliding is the worsening of the media freedom situation in many of these countries. I think there is a direct link between that and the overall decline in the quality of democracies. And what we have now, and this is where I want to make the distinction between what we had before. I agree that there were periods for example, in some countries in Eastern Europe that saw independent journalism thriving because of the entry of foreign investors and because of the rise of many media outlets that were operating independently. But we also had at the time lots of problems in many media markets. The issue of concentration of ownership existed many decades ago. Problems with how regulation was politicized in many countries existed before. So the question now is, why are we now worse off than we were back then? And why we are, in fact, is because what we are going through is what we discussed before, which is this phenomenon of media capture, which is an unprecedented phenomenon consisting of the rise of business structures that operate in tandem with state authorities in capturing media outlets. We'll probably touch on this topic a lot during the conversation. So the question, what do we have today, and how spread what's the spread of this decline in media freedom? I think it is worse than we've ever experienced in the modern era. But we have to distinguish between various groups of countries, so to speak, because first of all, we have a number of factors. We have legislation, for example, that is in many countries encroaching upon independence of the media. We have the financial crisis was a huge factor that actually led to an increased vulnerability of the media, and that's why many got bought, because they suffered financially, and oligarchic structures or other people started to buy media outlets. So we have a number of factors, and I'm sure you are totally familiar with them. But what's really important to say is that where this model led was a spread of the propaganda model that we have in many of these countries. I think that the countries that Bilge mentioned from the Freedom House studies fit very well that pattern. We have the rise of this propaganda model in many of these places, and in parallel we have seen a shrinking space for independent journalism, and that is the most dramatic change in how we operate, how journalism operate, because the shrinking space is actually the biggest and the most dramatic consequence of the media capture. And this is the situation we have today. We can speak a lot about that and give lots of examples. As I said, we have to distinguish, I believe, between various groups of countries, because we have on the one hand groups of countries like China or North Korea, or where things haven't actually improved much. If you look at them, there was no democracy first of all to start with. Then you have countries where that passed the communist regimes in Central and Eastern Europe, where there was a lot of hope that they will evolve towards democracy, and there was a decade of democracy in the 90s, but then we have started to already see this democratic backsliding. So you have a variety of countries, but what is really important is this decline in media freedom. And I believe that's the short answer to your question. I believe that the media capture is the root of those problems. And I'll just finish with a study, because part of the problem and the reason why we have this rise of the propaganda model is because of the overwhelming and again unprecedented rise of the role of the governments in the media in various ways, by funding media outlets, by controlling media outlets, by setting up media outlets, governing media outlets, and so on. And at the end of the day, there is nothing wrong with governments funding journalism, because governments fund arts, culture. Is actually great to have public resources going into the media. But the problem we have here is use of public resources to control the media outlets. That is the problem we are talking about, and that goes again at the heart of the media capture. And I was saying that I will finish with this study. We published last year a study covering 150 countries in the world, focusing specifically on state media. And we try to analyze various aspects of their work. The study is packed with details about, for example, how they are funded, how they are governed and managed, how they are controlled editorially, if they are or not. And of course, you have a lot of findings. But what was really, in a way, shocking was that 80% of all the state media outlets in these countries that we mapped in the world lack editorial independence. And again, from many of them, you expect that, because if you look at countries like Venezuela, Iran, and many others, yes, they've never had this independence. If you look, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, you have a bulk of countries where nothing has changed for 30 years. And again, it's nothing surprising there, because they tried reforms, but they never managed to do it. But when you look at the countries that tried the democratic experiment, that's where the problems are, and that's where the shocking finding comes from, because you see you had the decade of the 90s, and then you see exactly the problem you are describing, all of you here, the democratic backsliding. In our study, only a total of 18 media outlets qualify as independent public service broadcasters, like the BBC and so on, and most of these cases are in Western Europe. So I think these two findings are quite relevant and tell us a lot about this. First of all, the spread of the propaganda model, the dramatic pace of democratic backsliding, and third, the very steep decline in media freedom.
Thank you, Marius. Actually, it was a very good connection, establishing good connection between media consolidation, conglomeration, but why is it worse now? So we are now using more and more the concept of media capture to refer to these problems, along with polarization and maybe increasing self-censorship among journalists and declining media freedom. So if I can turn to you again, Bilge, to further reflect on this concept of media capture in its relation to media freedom in Turkey, maybe the current situation, or maybe to sort of evaluate how it developed and what has changed maybe in the last 20-25 years.
Okay, thank you. Sure. Again, just to lay the groundwork, by media capture, we refer to how media organizations, media outlets become subject to or are captured by, technically captured by, powerful elite or class interests, right? In media capture, a couple of points are worthy of mention. The first one is the concentration of media ownership in the hands of the few, right? The economic elite. And Işın already talked about how this started to transpire, like in the 1990s, right? And what happens when media ownership is concentrated in the hands of the few? We see biased coverage, we see low levels of political accountability, we see corrupt relationships between governments and media owners. Again, in Turkey, we have, like, unfortunately, so many stories, of these kinds of relationships. And this goes back, like, further to the mainstream right governments in the 1990s, the coalition governments in the 1990s, right? And as a result of media capture, we witness the declining of the news media's watchdog function, right? Because there is politicized coverage, because the information, news and information are manipulated according to the ruling government's political agenda, right? And this capture can occur in direct and indirect control mechanisms. So obviously, direct control mechanism is the actual, like, capturing or, like, taking over of a media organization, the closing down of a media organization, the transfer of the assets of the media organization to, like, the state agencies. But indirect control mechanisms are also important tools that anti-democratic actors avail themselves of. So state subsidies or bailouts or preferential distribution of state advertising or tax breaks for media owners, right? So given all these tax breaks, credits, cheap credits from state banks, privatization deals, state subsidies, right? We are all very familiar with examples from recent years in Turkey, as you have mentioned, like the pool media, like where they come together and pool their resources to toe the Erdogan government's line, but also pooling, in another sense of the word, pooling, like all these state sources, right? And in this case, we're talking about, like these huge conglomerates in construction, energy, business, finance, you name it. So while these, tax credits, privatization deals, cheap credits from state banks, they are, like doled out to government-friendly or pro-government actors, right? They are also withheld from critical media outlets. And I think this has been, like a very important turning point in Turkey. In, I think it was 2014, there was a report about how pro-government media companies have hugely benefited from, like state advertising, whereas these state advertisements were, like withheld from critical media outlets. And again, this brings me back to what Marius has said about the importance of, like the financial crisis and technological changes in the media landscape. So especially, like during those times when media outlets find themselves under increasing pressure because they're losing advertising revenue to, social media or, like web-based news outlets, and, like even Google or Facebook. So advertising revenue from traditional, advertisers become ever more important for them, right? Turn into a lifeline. So when, for example, in Turkey, state banks or big companies that are, like somehow under state control, like, Turkish Airlines and even, like big municipalities, right? They are also big advertising spenders. When they, funnel their advertising source of advertising dollars to particular pro-government newspapers or news outlets, news media, and withhold them from others, that means, like the decimation of government critical outlets. And just to, like say a few things about this kind of, like long trajectory of media capture. Again, I think it's important to recognize that, like this didn't happen overnight. Yes, 2007, 2008 are, like critical turning points. But I would even go back further a little bit. After AKP came to power in 2002, it's also started to, capitalize on the government, on the economic crisis that happened in 2001. So as you'll remember, like there was a huge banking and financial crisis. Again, this goes back to what Marius said about, the the import of financial crisis on media system and media actors, right? So the AKP kind of took advantage of this banking crisis that occurred in 2001, and starting in 2002, it started to deploy TMSF, what we call in Turkish Tasarruf Mevduat Sigorta Fonu. It's the Savings Deposit Insurance Fund. So it's a government agency that operated under the Prime Minister's office. And because the major banks, collapsed, their media companies under their control also collapsed, right? So this wasn't just, I think, a banking crisis, but it was also, like a media sector crisis. So TMSF, the Savings Deposit Insurance Fund, started to take over these, collapsed banks and the newspapers, television channels, and radio stations that they controlled. And then after a market evaluation, they sold them off, right? So after this, right, the TMSF operations, by 2006, the media landscape had changed considerably, right? Major media companies such as Bilgin and Uzan, that they kind of had been eliminated, right, because of their financial troubles. And we witnessed the emergence of new players such as Doğuş and Ciner, right? But I think the most visible example of media capture by way of TMSF was in 2008, when they sold Star newspaper and Kanal 24, right, the news channel, to the AKP-friendly Sancak Holding, right? So this was a complicated process of expropriation, sales, resales, right? It took several years. And then in 2011, TMSF, the insurance fund under the Prime Minister's office, under Erdogan's control practically, they took over Sabah ATV, which was one of the largest television newspaper enterprises in Turkey. And they cited some criminal charges based on, past financial transactions between its old and new owners, etc. Long story short, Sabah ATV was sold to the AKP-friendly Çalık Holding. And at the time, the CEO of the company was Erdogan's son-in-law. So this, I think, was, the beginning of the cultivation of a pro-government friendly media bloc, right? And in 2009, of course, we need to mention the tax levies imposed on, Doğan Media by Ministry of Finance. Again, this was kind of like a coercive measure that was used on media, mainstream media. So this was kind of, like one stone, two birds situation, because it on one hand, they imposed this huge levy, like $500 million, and then later approximately $3 billion, which in total, it was almost the equal of the entire company's assets, right? That was a huge blow. So on one hand, they use these tax evasion charges to kind of, silence Doğan Media. But on the other hand, they also taught a very valuable lesson, so to speak, to other media outlets, right? As if to say, look, this could be happening to you too. So that's another important, I think, turning point. And obviously, while all of this is happening, between 2008 and 2011, there are the, politicized investigations, Ergenekon and Sledgehammer, and not only, military officers and, political dissidents are jailed, but also journalists, right, and civil society actors. So we also need to, keep in mind how usually these either direct and indirect measures go hand in hand, right? For me, another turning point is, what happened after 2013, after the Gezi Park protests, and especially the corruption scandal that broke out in, late 2013. And then, the takeover of Gülen-affiliated media outlets, right? So first Zaman newspaper and then Samanyolu TV, their offices were raided. And they were charged with forming this illegal terrorist organization that was trying to overthrow the government. So this, like went on in, like 2015 with other Gülen affiliated newspapers and television outlets, those that were owned by Koza İpek, and some of them were removed from the satellite lineup. Offices were raided, their editors-in-chief were removed, and they were replaced by government appointees. To make a long story short, I think the final blow was, what happened after the coup attempt, right? So
maybe we can, sorry to interrupt you, Bilge, maybe we can sort of look deeper in the sort of what happened after post-Gezi protests context in more detail in relation to also the impact of digitalization and the rise of maybe social media. It is a lot to sort of consider, because there are different factors impacting on the media here. So maybe I'll just turn to Işın now to reflect on from her personal, professional perspective for the turning points you have just identified, and I leave the floor to you, Işın.
Thank you. It is perfect how Bilge Yeşil, periodizes and analyzes the situation, and it coincides with much of my experience. I would like to tell that why we had one point regarding why we felt much more freer at the start of the 2000s. Why? An important factor that I should mention that in December 1999, Turkey was officially recognized as a candidate for full membership of European Union. Of course, this was not only this was a changing game, game changer, but also it was giving hope for all the Turkish public as well. The future will be brighter if we can get to the European Union. We will be living in much more better in economically, democratically. We will have much more polarization, and so as media workers, we were sharing this hope. And we were optimistic, and we were working, we were trying to function really, that Bilge beautifully mentioned, that this watchdog function that we forgot. We tried to do it with this new optimism in a better way, and also we had the tools. This 24-hour news channels really were game changer, because also our owners saw that news can sell. Because the advertisements were pouring in, if I'm not mistaken. Of course, media and journalism is a expensive thing to carry on, but I think so it coincided. But I would like to tell why I did mention 2007, because as a journalist, it was a turning point for us, because Hrant Dink was killed at the beginning of 2007, and immediately that year was the AKP's second coming to power, with much more votes gained, and also more capture of parliamentary majority, and which gave them more tools to change in politically, in judiciary, in also media setting. More power, they were more powerful. And between after Hrant Dink was killed, there was also changes in the media, which, as Bilge put it very nicely, which helped AKP government to win over this military's grip on power before we affected our also journalism, because we were very afraid of military's tutelage, because of the tutelage, and media owners were mostly before then close to that power, but it changed. also, I would like to tell that, but I was still in. It took. I can tell this between 2007 and 2010. Things began to change as a journalist working inside a company. Before then, even if there were problems with the government or other corners of power, telling our owners, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. Our immediate colleagues, I mean the editors, never told us those problems to us directly. But starting from 2007 or 2008, maybe I should mention, we began to feel much more pressure, because our editors had more pressure from the owners and other circles and political circles. And I remember the AKP ministers and people would really like to be on, for example, NTV. It was very important, so they were also pressurizing us to give them more space, time slots in the TV. So I just wanted to make these remarks, and afterwards maybe we can talk about the other half till we come 2022.
Thank you, Ishin. So we are moving by periodization, which is kind of coinciding with different periods of AKP governments as well, in a way. These changes somehow coincide with this periodization. And I'd like to ask you, Marius, in terms of media capture, what is the situation in other countries? In terms of authoritarian tendencies or increased pressure on the mainstream media, because I think this is also relating back to what you said about the pressure on independent media versus mainstream media. So if you could reflect on that on a sort of maybe more regional perspective there.
Sure, of course. Let me first refer to media capture also in terms of its logic and its components. And what I mean here is the fact that, because I mentioned some minutes ago the difference between tendencies like concentration of ownership or politicized regulation, politicized state media that we always had, but what we have now is a different phenomenon where you actually see as Birge defined it, groups of interest, elites taking control of many parts of the media field. And our question as researchers was, what exactly happens? So we try to actually point at the exact parts of the media ecosystem that are being controlled, and we try to understand the reason for that. When it comes to reason, let me start with that. There is a logic, so to speak, of the media capture. That's why the phenomenon is it has more impact than tendencies before of concentration and all that on independent journalism, because it has a logic. And part of this logic, we noticed that, for example, before, like roughly 1 year or so before elections, you see tendencies related to capture. You see governments or companies close to the government starting to buy more media outlets. You see government spending more money in the state media and so on. And the logic there is purely electoral, because the whole media capture system that is built and is focused on the independence of media outlets is focused on ensuring that you win the elections. That is very important to understand, because these elites, the whole stake in the game for them is to make sure that they do not lose elections, because if they lose elections, they lose access to resources. So this is the end of the story, and we have to really understand that the phenomenon through this lens and through that logic. If we understand that, then we try to check a model on various countries and understand what exactly is being captured and where do you have capture. And we came up with a model that has been, we published a number of articles and and academic papers about that, we notice that there is a correlation, for example, between 4 things. One is regulation. The second is state funding that is being spent, as it was already said, preferentially to media outlets in the form of state advertising in most cases. The third is the state media or public media, so control over that is important. And the fourth is control of private ownership. The fourth one is very important because that is most difficult to achieve. The other 3 are quite easy. If you win elections, if you win the political power, you can immediately appoint your own people at the public media. You can immediately appoint your own people in the regulatory bodies, and you can immediately make decisions about state funding, where it goes. But with ownership, there is a problem, and that was the most difficult way to achieve, because you deal with private owners. In many cases, these are foreign owners with their own rules. It's very hard to actually push them out, but in the end, it happens through various ways. So just to summarize, when you have these 4 elements in place, you have a media capture environment. If you miss one, you don't actually have capture, because if you miss control either of the public media. In some countries, that is a very important player. If you do not own a lot of the private media outlets, again, you don't have the power that you need to win the elections. And the last thing that I want to mention is that usually in all the cases we looked, the trend is not to acquire all the private media. There is a tendency, if you look at all the countries and examples of media capture, where at some point they stop. They don't need, if they see that they have like the critical mass, 70% of the private media, they stop. Enough votes, enough media power, we stop there. And of course, they study the media market in the next elections and so on. So it's fascinating to look at the countries and apply this model to really understand. Now, coming back to your question, what is happening in other countries? If you think about these elements, this trend, if you try to apply the logic of the media capture in a number of countries, and we did it all over the world, it's hard to say that is a phenomenon that is specific for Eastern Europe, Turkey. It's everywhere, and you see we cross them inbreeds or crossbreeds. You have variations or variants, because we are now at the end of the pandemic, variants of the media capture in a number of countries. But if you ask me what countries actually implemented or developed the most sophisticated media capture models, I think very close to us, we can mention Hungary. Hungary is the classic example of media capture, and there are lots of studies. You can go there and see how it was done step by step. And the current government in Hungary, the political party in power, Fidesz, has been in power since 2010. They just won elections 2 weeks ago. And then in Europe, you have various tendencies. The Czech Republic had a tendency at some point when the prime minister was also the owner of many media outlets. You had similar trends. You have similar trends in Poland, for example, with the attack on the public television. So the steps, you can see the steps. But overall, I think the most extreme examples close to us in the region of media capture are Turkey and Hungary. They are really done at, a la carte, so to speak. If you go worldwide, in the world, you see such models elsewhere. You see, and these elites, this is a very important point to make, I think, when the elites that Bilge defined can be various elites. When it comes to Europe, or when it comes to our region, I think the oligarchic structures are very common. You have these companies that are very close to the government. They get public procurement contracts, and then they start to buy media outlets. If you go to other countries, you have different models. Egypt is another example of extreme media capture, and there you have the intelligence services, for example, heavily involved in capturing media. If you go to Nicaragua, another example, you have the family of the president is basically the whole family, taking over the media. So you have a lot of models, but it is a phenomenon that is, I think what's important to say, it is common for an increasing number of countries, and that is the problem. And it is a phenomenon that has long-lasting, a lasting impact on the independence of the media, and this is something that maybe we can talk further on.
Thank you. I think the points you have made in this, periodization that we are discussing, the points you have made about the elections is crucial. And for the last round of questions, I interrupted Bilge earlier about, to look at the situation in a post-Gezi context, but also that is the period when in Turkey there were a number of elections, local elections, general elections. And also that was, the period when the mainstream media was maybe losing its role, and the sort of born digital platforms were emerging. So in my last questions, I would like us to focus on how can mainstream media be restored, and if the digitalization in the media, independent media especially, can become a remedy to all the problems that we are discussing, because now we are in Medyascope, and Medyascope is one of these born digital platforms in this sort of post-Gezi context. So maybe we can all, in the last round, reflect on these issues altogether. Thank you, Bilge.
I mean, I also want to hark back to what Marius has said about this, long-term implications, right? So these are structural issues, and the problems of the media system in Turkey or elsewhere around the world in other countries, they are not going to change when the current government is ousted and a new government comes in, because these changes are ingrained in legislation, regulation, constitutional amendments, etc. So I think we have to acknowledge that these are structural issues. In the case of Turkey, they go way back to 1980s, the particular the neoliberal economic system that was established, the role of media owners in that system and their politicization, and the dwindling of journalistic professional norms. So I think one important thing to keep in mind is to how do we improve the media system that finds itself suffering every day, every week, from more and more attacks on freedom and the democratic rule. I think one important thing is to reinstitute certain checks and balances, right, on media ownership, on these particular economic relationships with the government and other state agencies. And I think another important point, aside from ownership, legislation, regulation, to bring back the democratic principles back into the game, one thing we need to acknowledge is the levels of polarization, right? I think polarization is very, very central to democratic backsliding, because as I said earlier, there are claims to one side being the good guys and criminalizing the other side. So we see this increasing tribalism, right? Not only in politics but also in media, right? So we see these different camps in Turkey, pro-government and anti-government camps. I think it's very important for digital-born outlets, Medyascope and others, to kind of help build a vibrant, pluralistic, and a diverse media system, right? To bring that vibrancy back into the media system, however challenging it might be, and lessen this polarization, right? Sharing the facts, checking the falsehoods, and remaking this, political discourse a less polarized and I think a more civil one. This is very, very important. And one thing that Stephen Haggard and Robert Kaufman, mentioned in their book about democratic backsliding is how, once autocrats come into power, one of the first things they try to do is to either control media, silence media, or delegitimize media, right? And they give the example of Trump, how he tried to, delegitimize media as this, source of, facts, truths, and, as this, field of expertise, right? And I think it's important, again, for digital outlets in media to fight against that delegitimization, that criminalization. We see this continued effort on the part of AKP and its proxies in media by pro-government pundits to, again, delegitimize these digital-born outlets, because a lot of them are funded by, foreign funders, right? And you will remember there was a heated debate, I think it was last year, about this Fondaş Media, right? This funded media organizations that are being funded by international funders, that they were, like these traders working with Western agents to destabilize Turkey, and they were, like enemies of the state. And I also remember a report that was published by SETA, which promotes itself as this independent think tank, but is actually, like financed and supported by the AKP government. It published a report called "Extensions of International Media Outlets in Turkey," right? And that was basically, like a listing of these Turkish services of Deutsche Welle, BBC, Voice of America, and also China Radio International, and the Independent. And basically, they were just like listing, the personal and political affiliations or opinions of their reporters. They're, like reporters based in Turkey. They were, like cherry picking from their Twitter posts, again, to give the impression that these were, like extensions working from inside Turkey to destabilize the country. I think one of the most important things that digital-born outlets need to do is to fight against this delegitimization and criminalization, right? So transparency is obviously very important, who gets how much funding from who. And also in the public discourse, we need to make sure that, these outlets are not just, like enemies of the state or foreign extensions, etc., but they're trying to reinstitute or bring back this, like plurality and diversity back into the media system, which, of course, we know, like has been decimated over the years, slowly but surely. So I'll stop here, but
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bilge. And I turn to Işın in the same order. Now you can also maybe give us the digital-born perspective, since you have been in, traditional and new media.
I would like to do so, but after what Marius made us remember, it's very difficult, because we are in this very, very critical year. Just before the election, we have 1 year time. And also this election is much more critical for the government. It's a survival election, maybe. We think so, maybe, I don't know, we will see. And also we can see that the intimidation of media has already started. At the weekend, some local journalists were attacked, 2 people. And we are not maybe sure. Also this year, 1 journalist was killed again. We are not sure maybe yet whether this is because of their journalistic work. But I think we can never sometimes we can never make sure about that, because there's no investigation real that we can get. We can learn the facts. Unfortunately, the Justice Department doesn't work Turkey in the right way in Turkey. And also what Bilge said is very important. Yes, outlets like us, I think we are ready to be mainstream, and we are trying to we never thought ourselves as anti-government or anti-AKP outlet. We try to do our best to give a pluralistic, content. But the problem is with the social media has also structural problems. it makes polarization much more. I mean, it's what makes it bigger. The polarization, it helps to polarize the societies the way it works now. And also, I just when you told about this point that outlets like us should fight for against decriminalization, delegitimization. But think about with this new war, Russian war on Ukraine. Now, Russian outlets are also just Russia used to do for its foreign-funded media. Now, Western media is doing for this for the Russian media. I will not discuss whether it is right or wrong or why it is right, but what I'm saying is that this war also polarizes the scene, more polarizes the scene, even in Turkey. So it will be very difficult here for us. But I must tell, we need all media outlets like us have a problem in having sustainable funds, to go on working. So I know we have also in a deep economic crisis, and we really need our viewers, help to fund ourselves rather than taking funds outside or other models. We are working on that. But I should say that even if they cannot do more funding for us, give money for us using Pantheon, for example, they should like and engage with us on social media. Their support this year will be much more critical after what you both told. It's very important. I'll just stop here, I suppose.
Thank you, Bilge. It is actually very important what you say, because that maybe one day we will do another webinar on sustainability and how new models for supporting new business models can be for independent media. This is a crucial point, and I'm sure Marius will tell us more about it, that there is not an entire solution yet. I think, but Marius, I give the floor to you now. Thank you.
Yes, it is. That's a fundamental issue, because if we talk about independent media operating in these highly controlled and highly captured environments, we have to be realistic about the fact that independent media outlets operate against the whole system. If you look at the highly concentrated media environments like Turkey or Hungary, if you want to establish a media outlet, your competitors is the whole system that is more or less controlled by the government and their companies. So that makes the situation quite alarming and quite impossible to tackle, I would say. But just going back to your question, whether the mainstream media should be restored, I think the focus should be on something else, because I think what we are losing in media captured environments is something even more important and more profound. And to explain that, I think the polarization issue is very important. It was discussed quite a lot here. But one thing that one consequence of this polarization within the media field and the journalistic field is that it creates two camps, two distinct worlds of journalism. On the one hand, you have the propaganda system that has a lot of employees. They call themselves journalists, but and it's lavishly funded and it's very powerful. It has access to broadcast licenses, access to state funding, and all that. And on the other hand, you have the shrinking independent media, which is hardly has a business model, hardly survives, and is attacked from all parts. So when you look at that, what is happening when you see situation of people or organizations that want to fund independent journalism, they tend to fund two things. On the one hand, that they fund reactive journalism, and on the other hand, they fund corrective journalism. Reactive is because when you operate in such a system, the tendency of investigative journalism is to react and to run corruption investigations, to take the authorities to account, and nothing wrong with that, of course. And we have a lot of great examples of investigative journalism outlets that are doing an incredible job in Hungary, for example. But the tendency there is to fund them because they want to go after, those that capture the media. So all they publish are investigations about the topic. When it comes to the corrective part, that is the result of disinformation and of the propaganda system. And it's again a normal reaction when you have so much lies, so many lies and so much disinformation around you. When you have such a dominant propaganda system around you, another tendency of journalists is to fact check, everything, to expose the authorities. And that's why we have a lot of, initiatives of fact checkers. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. They are doing a very important job. But when you look at the two, when you look at the reactive and the corrective trends, what you are missing is a big part of the actual independent journalism that is shaping the political agenda, that is driving the important topics, that is actually writing about all the relevant issues in society. And that is something that I think should be really restored. Whether it's in the form of mainstream media or not, that's a different question. What to do with that's very difficult, but the situation is very bleak in these environments. But I think we have to be realistic and optimistic at the same time, because there could be solutions. One of them is to actually admit and understand the phenomenon and live with it, because it will live with us. And there is among some people this naive expectation that if the elections will bring someone else, that the opposition wins the elections in one of these environments, everything will be solved. And no, it will not be solved. A media captured system that has functioned for 12 years has already produced immense damage on independent journalism. It will not be solved in 1 day or 1 year. You need probably twice the time. So that's something that I think we have to keep in mind and be realistic about immediately, because we have to live with that. And whatever solutions we design, we have to keep that in mind. We have to measure the phenomenon, to understand the phenomenon, and to really find the best solutions. When it comes to solutions, just to be very brief, I think in the current context, of course, policy solutions are very important. Unfortunately, in these countries, you cannot talk about that, because the policy is part of the problem. The policy is the field that is already controlled by these governments and by these elites. So what remains are purely interventions. I think those who want to support independent journalism, whether foundations or other donors, or whoever wants to support independent media in these countries, on the one hand, in my view, have to support grassroots organizations, those organizations that really cover the field and that are very well connected with the local audiences. That is something that should be funded, and they do that. Many organizations already do that, and it's great. They should continue doing that. And the second thing, if we look also at the impact of the war now in Ukraine on the media outlets, and if you look at the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic and so on, you really see that if you leave these trends unaccounted, if you look at the Russian model, because everything comes from the Russian model actually when it looks to media capture, the intervention, what we need is really large scale interventions. Now we have to talk about big funds for the media outlets, because many of these outlets are in the situation where they really operate with very small budgets, and this situation will not continue because the capture will be there. So this discussion about huge major interventions in the media is very important. It has to happen right now.
Thank you, Marius. I think these points are very important about the creation of different types of journalism and what kind of maybe funds or support is necessary for independent media to thrive. We have just actually completed our time, but with maybe one word, if you can say something that we can be hopeful in the near future, what would it be?
Each of us?
Yes, just if you want to start, Ishin, just you go with one word or one sentence, to end on a positive note.
I'm 100% sure that there will be always journalists who will be doing everything they can to hold power accountable. So I'm so sure about that. And this is a fight, Nobody promised us a wonderful world. So we will keep fighting.
Okay. You will keep doing good journalism. Bilge?
Yes, I definitely second what Işın has said, and I want to also add, the fact that civil society tends to be, continues to be, despite everything, very strong in Turkey. So I'm simply in awe of, the women's movement in Turkey, the youth engagement, in recent political, economic issues and crisis and everything, voicing their opinions, and other, ethnic groups, other marginalized groups. The LGBTQ movement in Turkey is also very, very resilient. And of course, academics, activists, and journalists, they're all part of this, so to speak, this coalition, right? They have been in this, resistance mode for a number of years, so to speak. But yes, we have, I think, all the reasons to be hopeful for this kind of engagement, for this kind of ongoing resistance. As long as we make sure, we have these economically sustainable models, there is audience support for these, outlets. Even if they're not subscribing, like Işın has said, engagement is very important on social media. So yes, that I am still hopeful.
Great, so happy to hear it. And Marius?
Well, very briefly, I think youth. It's also because I'm also teaching, and I teach a few journalism courses to young people who do not all of them want to become journalists, and that's great. And I'm trying to attract as many as possible to have this experience, at least for a semester. But the bigger point I want to make, and we haven't touched on that, I think people in the media, journalists, or wherever you are, I think we have to put a lot more emphasis on attracting these people to journalism, because they will be in hopefully in good positions to lead in a number of years. So that's extremely important.
Thank you very much for all your reflections, examples, and ending on a hopeful note. That's something I think we all need in these times. And I'd like to thank each of you for being here, for your time. And also I'd like to thank again for the collaboration of Medyascope and ELIAMEP, also for CATS Network for bringing us all together this afternoon. So maybe we meet again in a different context to pick up where we left from. So thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. A pleasure.
Thank you.